It was a new day. When Carter was delivering mail at Block A, he coincided with Melvin, who had just come out of the confinement cell. He was following behind a prison guard, carrying his personal items with him. He was probably being transferred to his new cell. Locked in Block A, Old Nine spurred the jeering. A chorus of unfriendly voices echoed through the corridors of the block, but Melvin turned a deaf ear to it all, keeping his eyes firmly fixed ahead, his gaze only pausing for a few seconds in greeting when he saw Carter. The block supervisor struck the railing with a baton, and the jeering crowd quietened. Carter didn't stay for long. He finished delivering the mail at his usual pace, after which returned to the admin block. Today, Carter was a little busier than usual. When Melvin was done with his cell chores, he still had to spend time conducting a lesson for Melvin. It was a proper reformatory class this time, specially targeted towards inmates who often stirred trouble. If Melvin continued to harbor dangerous lines of thought, then Carter could report it to the block supervisor, extending his confinement time. "Don't you go speaking up for him," Luke warned Carter. Carter couldn't be bothered to give an explanation. He flippantly denied it. "I won't." At this moment, Melvin appeared at the door of the library, still with handcuffs around his wrists. It was special treatment for inmates in Block A that they had to be handcuffed when moving between areas. "Wait for me in the ground floor meeting room," Carter said. The prison guard in charge of escorting Melvin made to bring him off, but Melvin didn't take a step. He stood still and asked Carter, "Will Officer James be telling me a joke today as well?" Before Carter could respond, next to him, Luke looked at him like he was looking at a ghost. "Did you seriously tell a joke?" Carter's ears heated. Annoyed, he said, "I didn't." Regular inmates would only be handcuffed under special circumstances, whereas Block A inmates would be handcuffed when they stepped out of the cell, only released during free time or when doing labor. Carter pushed open the door to the small meeting room, telling the guard behind, "Just release his cuffs." The guard looked conflicted. "That isn't too good." "No, it's fine," said Carter. "I'll take responsibility if anything happens." Melvin flexed his wrists, following behind Carter into the meeting room. This time he didn't sit at the very back, but at the first row, saying to Carter, "Thanks, Officer James." Carter didn't reply, directly flipping open the prison rulebook and reading it aloud. Despite being called a reformatory class on paper, it was mayhap better called a conversation. The ultimate purpose wasn't to cleanse the inmate's heart, but to see if the attitude had changed. If he still held a defiant attitude, then he'd be tossed back into the confinement cell. Following the usual flow of these classes, Carter finished reading the content pertaining to fights and scuffles, and lifting his eyes, he asked Melvin, "Are you clear on all of this?" Melvin appeared a little bored, as though he wasn't attentively listening to the contents that Carter spoke of, but still paid lip service, crystal. Still, when it came to Melvin's attitude, Carter wasn't worried, or he wouldn't have gotten the guard to uncuff him. He closed the book and walked to the front of the desk, leaning his hips against it and folding his arms in front of his chest, then said to Melvin, "Your sentence is very short. You'll be out soon. It's not worth it to get in trouble in prison." Melvin acknowledged, his gaze lightly brushing over Carter's legs. With the way that Carter was leaning against the desk, his legs were stretched slightly forward and appeared long beyond measure. His legs had always been very straight. Now, wrapped in the uniform pants, it assaulted the visuals with a surge of forbidden desire. Carter noticed Melvin's line of sight. He frowned faintly, asking, "Are you listening to me?" "I am." Melvin raised his gaze to meet Carter's eyes. "I can multitask." In other words, he was admitting that his attention was split. Veins faintly bulged at Carter's temple. "Did I ask you to multitask?" Melvin raised his right hand, tapping his own brain with his index finger. He said, "I can't help it." At this, the fire that had surged to the roof of Carter's heart putted out. He knew that feeling. Because he too couldn't control himself from analyzing others, nor could he control himself from taking up his monocular to look through the windows of Melvin's house. Sometimes human brains were akin to their subconscious selves, just refusing to cooperate with their external selves. Carter didn't say anything more. He stood back behind the table, changing the subject. Why did you learn how to fight? Actually, what Carter wanted to ask was boxing specifically, but that would be too revealing, so he chose a safer way of putting it. Melvin's punching had technique. He was obviously someone who had been trained. Among the convicted felons that Carter had encountered, he'd never come across one like Melvin, a guy clearly in for a financial crime, yet not losing out in the slightest to those in for more vicious crimes. Do you really want to know? Melvin asked. Why, is it some kind of top-secret information? Carter raised his eyebrows. Not at all, Melvin smiled, because some people were just asking for a beating. Such as? Melvin didn't appear to mean to delve into the topic, but seeing that Carter was still waiting for his continuation, he quieted for a moment. In the end, he exhaled, relenting, saying, such as those who laugh at me and call me illiterate. In all honesty, this answer did surprise Carter somewhat. He asked, but you can read, right? Yeah, it's just hard, Melvin said. The strokes form differently in my eyes than it does for most, but it isn't that I can't read at all. Dyslexic people had different spatial awareness than regular people did, which also allowed them to think better on their feet. However, it was difficult for thought processes to be judged, whereas being illiterate tended to leave a more striking impression. Per Carter's understanding, normal adults wouldn't mock others as illiterate to their face. Recalling that Melvin was a high school graduate, he guessed, did you beat up your classmates? Yeah, Melvin said, so I frequently transferred schools. I was what the teachers would call a stereotypical academically poor student. Carter abruptly thought of a saying, advise magnanimity and the heavens will strike you down. Humans were not interconnected in their joys and sorrows. Without having walked in someone else's shoes, yet advising them to be tolerant and magnanimous as if it was only natural, was extremely boorish behavior. He didn't have any grounds to criticize whether Melvin's method was right or wrong, but under the present circumstances he still said, prison has a rather unique environment. Try to refrain yourself if possible. Melvin chuckled softly, saying, I've said this before. I'll listen to you, Officer James. Compared to Carter's sternness, Melvin's tone was relaxed, making Carter feel like he was being too nosy, fretting over something that wasn't his business. At this moment, Melvin spoke again. Speaking of, Officer James, since I've let you listen to my stuff, shouldn't you let me hear yours too? I have a very normal background, Carter said. His family was decently well off and his parents had a good relationship. Though he had a more intense curiosity than average, he was still very clear of where the boundaries lay. Don't you have any special hobbies? Melvin asked. Carter's guard abruptly rose. He was willing to wager that Melvin hadn't just casually put forth this question. Flipping from passive to active, he calmly looked at Melvin, saying, Don't you know? Melvin gently arched an eyebrow, obviously surprised that Carter would respond in this way. Dense interest congealed in his eyes, and the corners of his lips curved up slightly. I'm not sure. From the looks of it, he wasn't completely exposed yet. Classic Melvin style, Carter had learnt it from him. Deliberately showing a little bit of a tail, luring the other onto the hook, then fishing out the information he wanted to know from the other's mouth. He didn't think that this move would actually work so well. Carter glanced at his watch. It's about time. You can go back first. After, Carter stamped a pass on Melvin's review form. Right at noon, Melvin's figure reappeared in the library again. He was still seated in the corner by the windows, only that other inmates deliberately kept a distance from him today. Carter scanned the silent library. Seeing that everyone was quietly reading and not up to anything funny, he idly went through the folders to open the monitoring software, opening the visual for the neighboring recreation room. In actuality, Carter didn't check the situation over there every day. Inmates would need to pass by the front door of the library to go to the recreation room. Sometimes Carter could roughly tell what was happening in the recreation room with just a glance at who was involved. If it was smoking or playing cards, he couldn't be bothered to open it. But if the people he saw surprised him, then that was a different story. For example, today, two people went to the recreation room together, one of whom was the thug that entered the prison at the same time as Melvin, also the guy who groped his ass, whereas the other was the notorious princess of Southside Prison. It only went without saying that for an adult male to have such a nickname had everything to do with him being a slut. But not many guys in prison dared to mess with him, because he was Shay's girl. Previously, when Melvin beat up Old Nine to the point of requiring external medical attention, Shay paid no heed to it. But if anyone dared to touch a hair on Prince's head, they would be playing with Dragon's fire. Anyone who had been in prison for any length of time wouldn't dare to hit up Princess. Only a thug like him who was still a muddle-headed greenhorn wouldn't know that this big brother's girl was out of bounds. The two on the interface quickly got down to doing the deed, and Carter gave a moment of silence for this thug before turning off the surveillance interface. No matter what, once Princess had his eyes on them, they would become a thorn in Shay's sight. Before, when Carter had just started working at Southside Prison, only because he had spoken a couple of sentences to Shay, Princess stared at him for a full week. After ascertaining that he wasn't interested in Shay, Princess stopped sauntering around the library. Between the two, if it must be said, Shay was a bit better. At least, he didn't actively seek to harm the innocent. About 10 minutes later, the back door of the library was pushed open. Princess walked in. The last time that Princess came to the library, it was to stare Carter down, and now, in this library, Carter's nerves pulled taut all of a sudden, for he saw Princess walk straight towards Melvin. The tables in the library were long and there were many seats. People who didn't know each other wouldn't normally sit together. However, after Princess entered the library, he went straight to sit next to Melvin and with his chin propped on a hand, stared unabashedly at Melvin just like that. Melvin shifted his body towards the windows, impassively giving Princess a glance askance, then returning his attention to the comic book. The library was extremely quiet. Carter could hear Princess whisper to Melvin in a dainty voice, "Hey, handsome." Melvin's brows knit. He looked at Princess, baffled. "What?" Melvin bounced back. Unconsciously, Carter's eyebrows had furrowed. "You're incredible. Can you teach me?" Unable to endure it any more, Carter slapped the newspaper on the table, frowning as he spat out a word in their direction. "Quiet." Languid, Princess sat upright, looking over at Carter. He had already stayed in prison for 8 years thereabout and was one of those inmates who didn't fear the prison staff. Additionally, with Shay backing him, most prison guards wouldn't have any business to take up with him either. But the library was Carter's territory. Just like how he wouldn't encroach on someone else's territory, he didn't allow anyone to encroach his territory. Princess and Carter stared at each other for a time, during which Melvin was also looking at Carter. A while later, Princess averted his gaze, turning back to Melvin. "Handsome." "Another word and you get out." Carter directly raised his voice, interrupting the rest of Prince's sentence. The other inmates in the library were watching the two of them cautiously, looking split between being afraid to draw fire whilst also irresistibly drawn to gossip. Carter was unyielding. If Princess did speak another word more, he would drive him out. However, before their soundless confrontation saw a conclusion, Melvin stood up, gazing down at Princess, saying, "Move." Melvin was in a corner seat, thus could only come out if Princess made way. While facing ahead, Princess darted a sidelong glance at Melvin, then leaned back, crossing his two arms in front of his chest with an ugly expression on his face. This posture couldn't really be considered as giving way. He only left a small space. If Melvin wanted to get out, typically, he could only step across his body. However, Melvin didn't do that. Instead, he bluntly used his knees to knock the legs away, just as if Princess didn't exist, squeezing him aside. After coming out from the corner, Melvin came straight to the first row. There was another inmate seated there originally. He walked to stand in front of the other, staring expressionlessly at him, and that person had the acumen to harden his neck and take his book to another seat. The first row seats by the window were the closest to Carter. Melvin sat down here, opening his comic book again, indifferent as if nothing had just happened. Carter also didn't expect that despite the short time that Melvin had entered prison, even some of the longer-serving inmates in prison didn't dare to squabble with him over seats. Behind, Princess rolled his eyes, disinterestedly leaving the library. However, from Carter's understanding of him, he wouldn't give up so easily. Even if in the end he really couldn't bag Melvin, he would at least let Shay know, forcing him to take a hit. This earlier episode didn't affect the other inmates in the library. Everyone read their books as they should, and when it eventually reached 2 o'clock, they automatically returned their books and left. Melvin placed the comic book back on the shelf. But when he came to Carter's work area, he was holding another book in his hands, a complete collection of cold jokes. Carter's lips twitched. "Put the book back." Melvin laughed softly. He sat down next to Carter, straightening his expression, and said, "Who was that just now?" "You mean the one flirting with you," said Carter. "His nickname's Princess. You'd best stay away from him." "Why?" Melvin asked. Carter explained the situation between Princess and Shay, warning Melvin, "You've already incited Old Nine, and Old Nine is under Shay's wing. If you annoy Princess as well, he won't let you off for sure." Melvin looked thoughtful. He asked, "What is Shay in for?" Carter's heart stuttered. "Are you thinking of revolting again?" The last time when Melvin asked about Ollie's crime, he ended up stirring a big fuss. If he really went for it with Shay, the fuss arising from this might be something that even confinement couldn't settle. His sentence might even be increased. Murder. He killed someone. It's a death sentence that was changed to life imprisonment, Carter said seriously. "I repeat, don't get on his bad side." Melvin nodded, pensive, asking, "And what if that princess comes to annoy me?" Frankly, that was a very likely scenario. He works at the sewing factory. Aside from the afternoon break, the two of you usually shouldn't have much chance for contact. At this, Carter paused, contemplative as he said, "Just avoid him during meals, and come to the library during free time. I can help you keep an eye on him." As soon as the words were spoken, Carter felt something amiss. He and Melvin had no relation whatsoever. Why would he, for no good reason, help him keep an eye on Princess? Melvin seemed to also notice this point, gazing at Carter and asking, "Officer James, are you covering me?" Carter cleared his throat, an awkward look on his face. "What I mean is, as a prison officer, I'll keep an eye on him." "Okay," Melvin said. "Thanks, Officer James." Carter felt that his explanation wasn't solid enough, so he added, "The warden still needs you to study stocks for him. I don't want him to have any business to pick with me." Melvin hummed carelessly, clearly not taking this reason seriously. "Also, I don't want an incident to happen in my library," Carter went on. "Yep," Melvin said. "In essence, Officer James's reason for helping me is because of the warden, because of the library, and most assuredly not because it's me. That's what you're trying to say, right?" Carter pursed his lips. He also realized that he was overdoing it, but it also wasn't possible for him to take back his earlier words, so he could only thicken his skin to say, "That's right." "Got it?" Melvin nodded, as though completely nonplussed about this question. However, Carter was clear inside that he hadn't managed to hide any of it at all.